Hi everybody, my name is Erica Stone-Burnett. I am the organizer of the at-home conferences, Addressing Trauma, Helping Overcome Modern Experiences, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about macro social work, advocacy, and community organizing. I got into macro advocacy, community organizing, because I am a huge control freak who thinks that I know how to do everything better than everyone else. So I'm sure that none of you feel that way, none of you act like that, and so you can just skip this, but for those of you who do, macro advocacy community organizing might be for you. I have always noticed systems. I was home with my family for many years and I homeschooled my kids, and so I got to create all of the policies and the systems. But at some point I put my kids into public school and I noticed a lot of policies and a lot of systems. And other than being a control freak who knows better than everyone else, I am also a person who likes to ask why, and I like to rebel, and I like it when people say no to me so that I can prove them wrong. So I noticed all these policies and these systems in public school, and I thought, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. I have always really admired innovative people like Steve Jobs. Love him or hate him, he changed our society forever. I really admire millennials as a group. They grew up in a really different generation, in a really different society. And, I don't just think millennials have ruined avocado toast. I also think they've come up with some amazing innovations and ideas and problem solving skills. I learned about advocacy and macro social work my first semester of my MSW program, in which I took a class about diversity. We learned about racism and privilege, and of course I didn't think I was racist, and I also thought that I had unpacked all my privilege, and I found that that was not true. The professor of that class suggested to everyone ways to get involved with anti-racism and advocacy for vulnerable communities. So I joined NASW, which is the National Association of Social Workers, and I started going to those meetings, and they needed someone to be a liaison between NASW and a local advocacy organization, an umbrella organization for all of Tulsa. And so I offered to do that, and I went to one of the meetings, and I came home from the meeting for this advocacy organization, and I just thought, they are doing it wrong, and I could do it better. And it's a wonderful organization, and they are not doing it wrong, and I cannot do it better, but that was what I thought. And so I started doing some other things. I started going to town halls and some really local political meetings just to see what those systems were like. And the turning point for me was when Tulsa was choosing a new police chief. The mayor had these public town halls, and he had 3 in a row. One in North Tulsa, one in South Tulsa, and one in Mid Tulsa. And if any of y'all are from Tulsa, we have a really serious issue with racism here. We were the site of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It's been almost 100 years. And following that, Tulsa became a self-segregating city. And it was just reinforced. And people of color primarily moved to North Tulsa and West Tulsa. And white people moved to South Tulsa and stayed there. And even when I moved to Tulsa, I moved to South Tulsa. So at these public town hall meetings, people started talking not just about the police chief, but also about Live PD, which is this entertainment reality show that follows Tulsa police officers around as they're making their arrests. And statistically, North Tulsa, which is where people of color live, is way over-policed. People of color are much more likely to be arrested. There's more police stops. And so Live PD really exploits vulnerable communities. So Live PD was brought up at one of the town halls, and I had not heard a whole lot about Live PD, but the community responded by organizing around it. And all of a sudden, the discussion of the police chief wasn't just about the police chief, but because the community had organized, it was about Live PD. And there were newspaper articles written, and there were stories on the news. And it really became this big thing that drew a lot of attention to what was going on. And I found that very exciting, and I found that very intriguing that a community could come together and advocate for some change. So that was basically how I came to really appreciate community organizing and advocacy. So today I am the organizer behind the at-home conferences. And the way that I came to that was in early March when COVID-19 was starting to become as horrifying as it is now. There were several social work conferences that were scheduled. And I started thinking, this is really bad. We should probably all stay home. People were starting to talk about maybe staying home was the best way to deal with COVID-19. And I pushed the organizers of these conferences to reschedule, to think about canceling, and I got a lot of pushback, and it was really disappointing. And eventually the conferences did get rescheduled or canceled, and I thought it would be really great if we could have an online virtual conference, sort of to compensate for the fact that we're missing these conferences, but also just for fun and for advocacy for social workers. So I reached out to, well, first I started thinking like, well, I'll present, we'll do this really low key. But then I thought, well, everybody's home now, and there are some professors and some community organizers and some advocates who have some time on their hands that might be willing to do this. And I reached out to people I knew. I reached out into the Tulsa community, and I said, hey, I am organizing this conference. And like, I didn't have a great, fully fleshed out idea, but I thought, well, if I get some great speakers, then I don't really have to have a fully fleshed out idea. I can just be like, hey, come listen to these amazing speakers. And so that worked out. I held my first conference in late March. The second one is April 18th, and I have one scheduled for May 16th. After the success of the first one, I applied to get CEU credits. So now I offer CEU credits at these conferences. I hired a designer to make things pretty. That's what I tell them, just make things pretty. And I now, because I have had 2 successful conferences, or at least one, and I anticipate this next one will be successful, can reach out even further to ask people to come and speak. So that's been a really positive experience. And I think what COVID-19 has done has laid bare a lot of systems that were not ready for a pandemic. I don't think there were very many systems ready for a pandemic. And that's okay. But that gives us an opportunity to look at all of our systems and think about what changes can we make. Advocacy doesn't necessarily have to be about making things better. That's a loaded term. That's a subjective term. But about making changes that are helpful for people. I want you to know that you are all advocates in your communities. And when we talk about advocacy, people think like, oh, macro, community, big. But when we get into the word community, it's like within community, there is micro, meso, and macro. Your micro community might be you and your partner, you and your kids, you and your dog. Your meso community might be your church or your temple or your mosque or your neighborhood. And then your macro community is going to be your city, your state, even your country. So advocacy on the micro level could be, I don't feel like my parenting is very effective. I'm going to make a chore chart. That's a policy change. That's a way to organize your community. In your relationship, things might not be going better. You might want to have date night once a week. That's a policy change. That's advocacy. That's community organizing. So probably most of you already do a lot of this, so I'm telling you just how to tweak it and do it on a bigger level. One thing that I try to do is think about, what do I want to do? Why do I want to do it? I get out there and I look at, are there other groups doing this? I was interested in public schools that use indigenous symbols as their mascots. My kid's school does that, and I feel very uncomfortable with it. So I reached out directly to the superintendent, and I didn't get an email back. And then I started looking on Facebook, and I did see that there was a group that focuses on trying to get Oklahoma public schools not to use indigenous symbols as mascots. So I reached out to that group and I said, hey, and they were like, yeah, we'd love to have you. That's the other thing. If you have any desire to work, volunteer in a community, do anything, go ahead and reach out, because I've never seen any organization that advocates for people say, no, we're good, we don't need anyone. They will take everybody who wants to help. And that's where I leave you. Think about ways that you want to help, think about communities that you want to help, and just get out there and do it and enjoy it. And remember, advocacy for communities includes advocacy for yourself. And I don't think there's anyone better to advocate for communities, for yourself, for your families than social workers. We understand what people might need and not be able to get the resources for that. So use that social work, get out there, help people, have fun, and be a community organizer.